Hello, hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Hope everybody's having a great start to their week. Hopefully a short week for everybody at home. Today we are hopping on live to talk a little bit about the tropics. In particular, we're talking about the hurricane that's been breaking records, breaking headlines, and I'm sure you've heard about it. We're talking about Hurricane Beryl. I want to thank you if you are tuning on in. If you are, drop me a comment. Would love to know where you are watching from. And I want to say right off the bat that this hurricane is not forecast to impact South Central Pennsylvania. We, in fact, have a gorgeous forecast for today, but it is still something of interest and something that is causing a lot of destruction through the Caribbean and is very impactful there. So it's something that we're going to talk about and really shed light on some of those records that have already been broken. So let's talk about the latest. At this point, we're getting updates from the National Hurricane Center every 3 hours with this storm. So this is going to be the 11 a.m. advisory. Winds of 160 miles per hour, but gusting near 200 miles per hour. Of course, that is centered around that eye wall of this storm. And as you can see, it's moving through the Caribbean to the northwest. It's moving at a pretty good clip, 22 miles per hour. So something that's continuing to impact many islands. You can see some of those outer rain bands and some of those outer clouds are over parts of the United States, like Puerto Rico, and headed into areas like the Dominican Republic. So a pretty massive storm. Another thing to note out of this satellite imagery here is that the storm is really healthy. It looks really good. It is symmetrical. You can clearly see the eye wall and the eye in the center of the storm. So just a sign of the strength and the power that it really has as we are taking a look thanks to some of the satellite products. So a Category 5 storm, certainly impressive there. And this storm has really been at that major level for quite some time now. Here's a look back at that wind history. It's been at major hurricane status since early Monday, late Sunday, something like that. So winds consistently climbing over the past couple of days. Now, right now we're looking at 160, 165 mile per hour winds. Really quite impressive when it comes to this forecast and something we're going to continue to monitor. Now, as I mentioned, this storm has been breaking records. It has been a fairly impressive storm, so let's talk about some of these records that we have seen. The first one, which is pretty notable, maybe not a record, but this storm strengthened from a tropical depression to a major hurricane in just 42 hours. Now, that is not something that you see every day. Of course, we are seeing more storms rapidly intensify as we see our climate starting to shift, but from a tropical depression to a major hurricane in 42 hours, that has only happened 6 other times in recorded history, and not until way later in the season. This storm is really pushing the bounds of how early we can see storms of this strength. Now, it made landfall in Grenada as the earliest Category 4 storm in the Atlantic Basin history, and our record keeping goes all the way back to the 1800s, so it's certainly something that is impressive. And then, of course, it increased in intensity after that landfall, becoming the earliest Category 5 storm in Atlantic Basin history. And we do the Atlantic Basin for the Hurricane Center. That is the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico. So those 3 bodies of water combined are what we call the Atlantic Basin. So we are breaking records right off the bat. We are continuing to keep an eye on the storm too, because I think we're going to get a couple of landfalls. We saw the eye again push over Grenada, and it does look like maybe some spots like Jamaica could be impacted from the storm. So here's a look at the latest tropical alerts from across the Caribbean. As you can see, Jamaica, the entire country there surrounded in that hurricane warning. We've got some spots as well, like the Dominican, where they are under tropical storm warnings. That's because they're more on the outer edges of the storm. It does look like Jamaica could be looking at potentially a landfall. As the center of that storm gets closer, that's where the highest impacts are. So that's what we're looking at when it comes to alerts right now. Nothing for the continental United States, that's for sure. Again, the center of the storm still in the middle of the Caribbean. Now, one of the tools that we use to track these storms, we're going to pull out the spaghetti plots. I'm sure you've seen them. This is the time of year where you're going to get really used to them. So I'm going to have these play for just a little bit here, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Every single one of these lines is a different computer model. It's a different solution or idea of what it thinks is going to happen with the center of that storm. So every single one of these lines is a completely different model. When it comes to these models, we love it when these spaghetti lines are close together, because that means everyone is on the same page. The more spread out they are, that means, well, there are so many solutions. How the heck are you going to know which one to choose from? That's when you get some forecasting expertise to come and help you out. So it does look like this storm, we have good agreement, it's going to continue on that west-northwesterly path path, I should say. As you can see, these models really still close together as we look ahead through the end of the week. Once we get beyond that, though, there is starting to be a little bit of uncertainty. Even the National Hurricane Center talking about that in their forecast discussion. Still something we're going to be keeping an eye on. Some of these models keep that remnant energy down into parts of Mexico. Some bring it up more towards the Gulf Coast around Texas. So no matter the strength of that storm, that's what the forecast models are kind of showing, the direction that it's headed. So something to watch, especially interests along the Gulf, especially the Texas Gulf Coast, keeping an eye on that. But that would be well late week and into the weekend that any impacts would even head our way. So way too far in advance to be making a critical forecast for at the moment. But that's one tool in the toolbox that we're watching when it comes to all of these forecast models and where this storm is headed. Now, another thing we're watching, and you'll notice the storm continues to track over water. It's in the Caribbean now. It could reemerge out over the Gulf. Well, we've got really warm waters, record warm waters in parts of the world, and so water acts as fuel for these storms. The more warm, moist air that they're able to pull, well, the more fuel they have to continue on their strength. That's why a lot of the times when these storms go over land, they lose the fuel and they weaken. So we'll have to watch. If we do end up getting a landfall in Jamaica or potentially over in parts of Mexico, that could help weaken the storm. So something that we're keeping an eye on. So that's a little bit about the environment we're dealing with, some of the tools we have. Let's get to the official forecast, because the National Hurricane Center, obviously those forecasters are the experts when it comes to creating these paths. So here's the latest on their forecast for Beryl. They do have it slightly weakening through the middle parts of the week. So through Wednesday, winds dialed back to 140 miles per hour. That's still impressive. That is still catastrophic damage if it happens where you live. But still, slow signs of weakening when we look at things, with that wider lens. It does look like that current path could have a direct impact to Jamaica. So something we're keeping an eye on through that Wednesday time frame. So just 24 hours from now, we'll be watching it as it continues to track to the west. Now, beyond that, the forecast does call for continued weakening. So by the time we get to Thursday into Friday, we're down to a Cat 2, Cat 1, and then we'll see what happens from there. Current forecast thinking does bring it close to the Yucatan Peninsula, which is going to be this peninsula here on Mexico. We'll have to see if it does cross the Yucatan. Oftentimes that could help break the storm up or at least weaken it a little bit. Beyond that, though, we saw how warm the Gulf waters were, so there is some uncertainty. Land interaction, the waters are really warm, which one's going to win out, So that's something we're keeping an eye on when it comes to this storm as it continues to push to the west. I see we do have some extra viewers now. If anybody has any questions about Beryl, please drop them below. I'd love to hear or, see what you're thinking, and if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. But that's the current situation when it comes to that tropical system, the hurricane, I should say. Now, there is another area that the National Hurricane Center is keeping their eye on. This has a very low chance of development. Things aren't looking great for this tropical wave. This is the wave in question here. It has a 20 to maybe 30% chance of development as it pushes to the west. So something we're keeping an eye on, but we are not all that concerned about. It is still fairly early in hurricane season. Here's the latest, obviously recapping what the forecasters were saying at the beginning of the season. The the National Hurricane Center said this is going to be a busy year. And I think this Hurricane Beryl is really a sign of what's to come. We have so much energy to work with already, and we are still so early in the season. So we could see continued major hurricanes as we look ahead. In fact, the Hurricane Center forecasting 4 to 7 major hurricanes. So that's going to be Category 3 or higher. Their forecast for total named storms, 17 to 25. We're actually on number 3. We have gone through 3 storms already. You probably missed it. Tropical Storm Chris formed yesterday, and just as quick as it formed, it fizzled on out. So sometimes storms can be as brief as that. It only takes one really big storm to have, quite so big of an impact that it becomes memorable. So it just takes one, but we are forecasting many as we look through this season. Here's a look at the names. We did, if you remember, have Tropical Storm Alberto. That has since passed. Again, we had Tropical Storm Chris. Chris is no longer with us, but Beryl definitely going to be, you know, a big deal when it comes to this season, and I hope it's not a big indicator of what's to come, but certainly all signs are pointing to an active season continuing as we look ahead. So that's the latest when it comes to Hurricane Beryl. I'm not seeing any comments, so if you are watching this a little bit later on and you want to drop a comment, we'll try and filter on through, and we'll continue to keep you guys updated when it comes to this storm. I really enjoy keeping an eye on the tropics this time of the year. I know we live in Pennsylvania if you're watching us from South Central PA on Fox 43, but we're not immune to those impacts from tropical systems. As we saw just a couple years ago, we can get flooding rains, we can get some of those storms with the remnants of tropical systems as they move up the coast. So we are always keeping an eye out on that forecast. We'll always be here to keep you weather smart. You can find the latest weather forecast for where we live on fox43.com/weather. That's where you'll find the 4th of July forecast here locally. More on that on our website. Chief Meteorologist Brain Long will have more on that coming up this afternoon as well. Until then, hope everybody has a great